And I'd like to pick up verses 16 and 17. And they read, "And there came a fear on all, and they glorified God, saying, that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. And this rumor of him went forth throughout all Judea, and throughout all the region round about it." Part C of verse 16 reads, "And that God hath visited his people." The Message Bible has a translation of that verse, and it says, that same part of verse number 16, and it says, "And God was at work amongst them." God was at work amongst them. So if you give me just a couple of moments, I'd like to speak with you from the subject this morning entitled, "When God is in the Building." When God is in the building. Amen. Come on, celebrate these young people who are ushering this morning. We appreciate them. They're in their African garb, and so they look great. Many of you do as well. Thank you so much for being a part of our program committee and for encouraging us to come in African attire on today, so we dare not forget our history and those who enable us to be where we are now. We are standing on the shoulders of those who have labored before us, amen, who were in slave ships and fought for us to be able to be where we are now. And so we appreciate our heritage, and we dare not forget where we have come from. The beginning of Luke chapter 7 begins to tell an account of Jesus interacting, or as Jesus is making his way, and that he receives a word from a Roman captain. People come actually advocating on behalf of the Roman captain, and they come saying that the Roman captain's servant is at the point of death. And so the Roman captain then sends word to Jesus, and he says, "My Lord, I understand who you are, but I also understand how inadequate I am." And so he then sends word, and he says, "Master, I would be embarrassed if you came to my house, because I am not a man who is worthy of you coming to my house." But he says, "But Lord, I have enough faith to know that all you have to do is say a word, and my servant shall be healed." And so Jesus responded to that and said, "I have never seen so great a display of faith as the one displayed by this man," that he then understands that there's power in words that Jesus can speak. And so Jesus spoke the word, and Luke says that as Jesus spoke the word, the servant was then healed and made whole. And then the word came back and said that the servant is now healed, and they began to question and ask, what exactly was the time that this transpired? And it happened to align with the time that Jesus then spoke the word. Sometimes, saints of God, all we need is for God to speak a word in our lives, and he will transform our very situations. So as I continue and close out my series this morning, we've talked about Zacchaeus, we talked about Nicodemus, we talked about Peter, and then last Sunday we talked about the Samaritan woman at the well. And so today I'd like for us to spend some time with the widow of Nain and visit with her as she is now going through one of the most difficult times of her life. So after Jesus has interacted with them and the Roman soldier's servant has been healed, the text says that Jesus is now making his way into a village that they describe as Nain. Nain is described as being a place that was glorious and full of green pastures. Nain is a place that is viewed as being that of happiness and greatness. Nain is a place that people would consider to be one of those that sat on the hillside, and it was just a beautiful particular place for folks to live and to be raised. But on this particular day, as Jesus is making his way into this village, Luke says to us that there was a funeral procession that was then making its way throughout the main street of the city. You would expect, and most times you would think that it would have been someone who was a little more senior, or someone who was up in age, who was now being taken home. Their journey on the earth has been concluded, and they have now made their way into their heavenly reward. You would think that that's what it was, but it's interesting that Luke tells us that Jesus looked and noticed that it was then a young man. A young man, that he had died. And so now the funeral procession is leading him probably to his burial. But Jesus notices that his mother is following closely behind the casket. He understands that she is too old to be his wife, and so he then surmises that this has to be the mother of this son. Not only does he then assume that and assume it correctly, but he then notices that there is no one standing with her. She is going throughout this experience by herself. She is having to experience this pain and this trauma by herself. There's a great crowd that is with her. Understand, I'm not saying that there was not a large number of people who were following after her. But anytime you have gone through pain in your life, there's a time you feel like you're going through it by yourself. You feel like nobody else can relate to what it is that you're experiencing. You feel like nobody else can understand what it is that's going on in your life. You feel like nobody else can totally appreciate why it is that you're in the pain that you're in. Sometimes people wonder, why is it that she's always crying and weeping? Why is it that he's always going through the situation where even his countenance appears to always be sad? Why is it that he cannot come out of this particular situation? Well, saints of God, I'll come today to tell you, sometimes pain is just what it is, pain. Sometimes pain is difficult, and it has you in a place where you're wondering, how will I be able to recover from this one? Sometimes pain has you going through life situations and life's journeys where you get up in the morning and you go through the routine, but for some reason you can't find yourself ever finding happiness. But is there anyone here today that can clap your hands and say, but I'm thankful when God is in the building? Now Jesus notices, and he notices that she must be a widow woman because she's in this by herself. There is no one else who is standing there beside her. There is no male presence that is standing there beside her. So he then assumes that she is a widow woman. A widow woman who is now burying her son. So imagine what this must have meant for her because she's living in a patriarchal society. One where everything is driven by the male presence in your life. Who knows, maybe this son was the only source of income for this woman. And so not only is she weeping and crying over the loss of her son, but she's also weeping and crying over the loss of a lifestyle that she will have no longer. Who knows, maybe this woman is now concerned about her identity because community will no longer recognize her because she now is nothing but a widow with no male presence in her life. And so people will then push her to the side and not deal or interact with her. Who knows, this woman is grieving over all of these various changes that are occurring in her life. And she is now wondering what tomorrow will bring. Well, y'all are looking at me like I am strange. Have you ever gone through a pain in your life where it has you wondering and questioning, Lord, will I ever come out of this one? Or how can anything good come out of this situation? God, can you turn this one around? I can't see how you can do it, God, because I'm questioning what it is that is going on in my life. So she is weeping, and she has found herself grieving over the loss of her son, and she is following behind the casket and following behind the procession. And Jesus he does something that I think we should all see as a model for us as to how we should treat humanity. Jesus shows compassion towards her. In 2019, where it's so much easier for people to post something about hate on Facebook. I would challenge you to say, can we show compassion towards one another? We may not know all of the particularities of the situation. We may not understand all of the different things about the circumstances, but that's an opportunity for us to show compassion. There are times that people make mistakes, and so we don't need to be worried about what the mistake is, but they are now going through a painful situation. Can we show compassion? There are times that people fall short and their judgment misses the mark, and so they don't make the right decision, and it finds themselves now having to deal with consequences, and they are having to confront those consequences, and sometimes those consequences are on public display. But can we show compassion towards one another? Sometimes people find themselves struggling and dealing with what they're having to face in their life because of what this life situation is bringing them. So instead of us looking down our noses at them, can we show compassion towards them? Jesus sees the situation and he shows compassion towards the woman, and then he immediately says to her, "Woman, weep no more." He says to her, I see your situation. So woman, there is no need for you to weep any longer. You have been weeping ever since the last breath left his body. Woman, there is no longer a need for you to weep. It's interesting to me that Jesus would then say that to her. Not only did Jesus display compassion, but he then also spoke to the woman. Sometimes, saints of God, we need to understand you may not be able to fix the problem, but if you just learn to speak to people, learn to show them some love, that in and of itself can bring some people healing. Your willingness to then be present and to just kind of speak kind words to one another. Sometimes that can begin the healing process. Jesus spoke to her and he said, "Woman, weep no longer." But Jesus not only stops there, but Luke says that as Jesus speaks to the woman, he then begins to put things into action, because what you must understand is that now Jesus lets her understand that she really is interacting with the one who is the creator and the giver of life. Jesus now wants her to understand that he has the power to speak life into a dead situation. And so not only does Jesus show compassion, Reverend Kirby, and not only does Jesus speak to her, but he also brings some action behind his words. Well, saints of God, some of you are saying, "But Pastor, how does that relate to me in 2019? Sometimes it's got to be a lot more than the words that you can say. Because you have the ability to affect somebody else's life. You have the ability to be a blessing to somebody. You have the ability to help turn some things around. So you got to be willing to take your selfish hat off and put on the hat that will have you operate in the body of Christ. You got to stop saying you shouldn't have done what you did, and learn and realize that sometimes if you want to be blessed, you got to learn to be a blessing to somebody else. Are there any witnesses in here this morning that can say, I'm learning that if I really want to be blessed, I got to learn to bless somebody else? Jesus teaches that, and he then follows through. She doesn't even realize who he is, but the text says that Jesus then takes some action, and he begins to put things in place. And the Bible then says that as the men are processing with the coffin lifted up and the young man lying on it with a dead body, that Jesus then reaches out with his hand and he just touches the coffin. Well, saints of God, I'm so glad that we've got to understand the example of what Jesus is giving here. Jesus wants them to understand that he is the beginning and he is the end.
Yes, he is.
Jesus needs them to understand that he is the Alpha and he is the Omega. Jesus wants them to understand that before anything was ever formed, he was. He is the present now and he is all that is to come. Are there any here today that can say, I'm thankful that God is the source and the strength of my life. I'm thankful that everything that I am is because of God. I'm thankful that I wouldn't be where I am without the hand of God in my life. But play with me this morning. Is there anybody in here that can say, as I look back over my life and I think things over, I can truly say that I have been blessed. I've got a testimony. Is there anybody in here who can say that had not been for the Lord who was on my side, I would be messed up? There's no way I could have ever made it. Is there anybody in here who can say, can't nobody do it like Jesus? Is there anybody in here that can say, he healed my body, told me to run on? Is there anybody in here that can say it's another day that the Lord has kept me? And because he kept me, I'm going to praise him. Jesus displays his power. Luke says that he touched the coffin. And it's interesting to me because most people would think that he would have touched the young man's body. But you got to understand, Luke is very detail oriented. He gives us a lot of details as to what happened. And if Jesus would have touched the body, Luke would have told us exactly that that is what happened. But Luke is very explicit in saying that Jesus touched the coffin. He touched the coffin, and saints of God, I too was perplexed by that. But I'm here today to tell you that God's got all power in his hand. And if he's got all power in his hand, he can touch the dead thing. He can touch the thing that's holding you down. He can touch the very thing that's keeping you from moving forward. He can touch the very shackles that have been holding you down. He can touch the bondage that's been preventing you from moving where you are. He can touch the paralysis that's been keeping you from moving forward. Are there any witnesses in here today? They can say, I'm so glad Jesus can touch the thing that is carrying me. And after he touches it, then life can be brought back into me. My Lord, is there anybody in here that can say, touch me? Touch me, Lord Jesus. I just need a touch from the Lord. Lord, I need you to touch my situation. Lord, I need you to touch my life. Lord, I need you to touch this bondage. Lord, I need you to touch this shackle. Lord, I need you to touch this medical situation. Lord, I need you to touch. Lay your hands on me, Jesus. I don't mind. I don't mind. I don't mind. Lay your hands on me, Jesus. I don't mind. I don't mind. I need him to touch me. I need him to touch me. I need him to touch me. Jesus touches the coffin. And after he touches the coffin, I wish you could see it the way I see it. With my spiritual imagination. What you've got to understand is that the coffin became a conduit for life